Greetings and welcome to the WordsAboutGames.net review of Middle-earth: Shadow of War, an action RPG released on October 10th, 2017 on PC, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, developed by Monolith Productions and published by WB Games. Shadow of War returns players to the role of Talion, the undead, unkillable ranger from the previous game who's been resurrected thanks to his bond to the wraith Celebrimbor. Behind enemy lines, Talion and Celebrimbor aim to put a stop to Sauron and his orc armies by engaging them in war, using a new ring of power to dominate the orcs of Mordor to forge an army and conquer Sauron's fortresses and territories.
To hazard a guess, he said, "You're all gonna die horribly."
There's no other way to say it. Shadow of War's core narrative is simply boring. It tells a disinteresting story populated by dull characters, orcs notwithstanding, who do nothing to engage players or even push the game forward. This is probably best exemplified by the protagonist Talion, who is a non-entity thanks to an almost complete lack of personality. The only time he ever displays one is when he's a colossal arsehole. It's a shame because the world of Middle-earth is ripe with storytelling potential. On the face of it, Shadow of War's multiple narrative threads sound great. There are quest lines that see you square off against Nazgul, hunt down a Balrog, and help the Gondorians survive in Mordor after a devastating assault. Quite how these exciting sounding story threads fail to deliver any sort of engagement is frankly a bit of a mystery. Picking up the slack marvellously, however, is the expanded Nemesis System. After a 5-ish hour opening act that sees the game spin its wheels attempting to set the game up with a sequence that could have been done with a couple of cutscenes and a single prologue mission, you enter Act 2, and the Nemesis System comes alive. Monolith have expanded on the system from its previous game in all the right ways. To boil it down to its basic components, the Nemesis System tasks players with overthrowing 5 orc overlords and taking over their respective fortresses. These overlords have war chiefs, and those war chiefs have captains, with each region populated by around 20 orcs. You'll need to slowly dismantle this orcish bureaucracy by killing the orcs in its service, or better yet dominating them and adding them to your army. It's quite workmanlike in concept, but it's how the Nemesis System reacts to your actions that makes Shadow of War a truly compelling game. As you make your way through each region and its orc occupants, you'll begin to form contentious relationships with your adversaries, and those you eventually come to count amongst your allies. In my 30-odd hours with the game, I experienced epic betrayals at the worst possible moments, epic unexpected ambushes while I was already engaged in combat or even just out and about the world, epic confrontations with mortal enemies I'd engaged multiple times before. My nemesis from Shadow of War even showed up at one point to thoroughly kick my arse. Epic last-minute saves from my bodyguard, epic encounters that spiraled out of control, and so much more. You might have noticed I used the word epic a lot. That's the overriding feeling of interacting with Shadow of War's Nemesis System. Aside from giving you the feeling that you're waging an actual war as opposed to checking boxes off an open-world checklist, and aside from making Mordor feel like a living world, the Nemesis System here feels so satisfying because it infuses your game with dynamic, epic moments. Your story is your own in Shadow of War. Your triumphs and failures, your enemies and allies will be totally different to anyone else who plays the game. The expanded Nemesis System also opens Shadow of War up to a huge variety of new and different mission types. You're able to assign yourself a bodyguard to call in to help you, or who can just show up in the nick of time and save your ass, as well as direct your followers to a variety of tasks that include backing up your other captains, infiltrating the retinue of a war chief, or leading a portion of your army during a fortress siege. It's easy to lose hours simply playing around with the Nemesis System. It honestly makes everything else feel superfluous, like it was designed simply to satisfy some unwritten criteria of being a quote-unquote open-world experience. The Nemesis System is all that truly matters here, and the way it affects and influences your personal story is glorious. Until you break it with loot boxes. When conquering my second region, I decided to use the in-game currency I had amassed to see what the inclusion of these divisive microtransactions would do to the game. They break it. Orcs found in these boxes are inserted into the world and overwrite the orcs you take down. It makes taking over a region simpler for sure, but it also removes a lot of what makes the Nemesis System feel so special by removing repeat encounters and the otherwise colourful characters you meet on your travels. Don't get me wrong, the orcs in loot boxes still have plenty of character to them. The only difference is that your interactions with them are wholly one-sided. They're your orcs from start to finish. Whatever your stance on loot boxes, whether you abhor them or you don't mind them, they shatter so many aspects of the Nemesis System, it's simply not worth buying them even with in-game currency. Avoid using them at all costs.
Bright Lord, Dark Lord, same thing really. End result's me ripping spines out, which I like to do anyway, so either way's a win.
While graphically the world of Mordor looks stunning in large sections of the game, there are frequent low-resolution textures that can break your immersion if you notice them. Character models get it the worst, especially in large group scenes. When you're lining up in preparation for a siege, for example, it's all too easy to spot numerous orcs standing right behind Talion who resemble wax statues whose faces have been melted. There are plenty of textures that look like they've been ripped from the PlayStation 2 era all over Shadow of War, with plenty of very noticeable texture popping to boot. Whilst in the full flow of fast-moving combat it's harder to notice, given that there's so much going on, you're only really focusing on fighting, killing and staying alive, it's still something that happens with too much frequency. During these hectic combat moments the game does run superbly, probably due to those scaling textures. No matter how chaotic my battles throughout Mordor got, how many enemies and allies clashed, or how many explosions and other effects were happening on screen at once, there were almost no performance issues or frame rate drops. And things can quickly spiral out of control, so kudos to Monolith for managing that, although it seems like the trade-off is a bunch of dodgy textures. The animations are absolutely standout in Shadow of War. It's actually a critical thing for the game to nail, given how important the look and feel of combat needs to be. Combat flows incredibly well, thanks to Talion and his foes chaining various moves together incredibly naturally, and the two sets of animations consistently clash and interact to present a thrilling ballet of satisfying action that few action games of this nature can match. The world of Mordor itself is surprisingly varied. There are 5 regions in Shadow of War, each well designed to aid and supplement the epic confrontations you'll have, with plenty of deep caves, tall mountains, lush forests, blasted wastelands, crumbling outposts, and more, giving you a variety of tactical options to suit whatever your playstyle might be. They also offer a good amount of diversity that helps keep the game fresh. Each new region you carve a path through is suitably different from the last, helped by the mostly pristine graphical fidelity that, when all the textures have loaded, looks fantastic. The game's ambient noise and suite of sound effects are a really well deployed secret weapon in Shadow of War, particularly in combat. They complement the top-notch animations to offer an enviable level of immersion. The general background chatter of orcs in the open world, the cries and shouts during battle, and the clashing of steel as swords clatter against one another all do a fantastic job of grounding you in whatever it is you're doing in the moment. Voice acting, however, is fairly flat across the board, with the orcs again being the exception. Anyone who isn't called Orc for something generally gives a dull, mundane performance thanks to a stilted script that flips between heavy-handed exposition or awkward attempts to evoking emotional responses. There are some talented people in Shadow of War's cast that try their best, but there's only so much they can wring out of a fairly poor script. The Orcs, of course, are the exception. From the mage characters such as E3 Scene Stealer Bruce, through the various overlords, war chiefs and captains, right down to the otherwise cannon fodder minions going about their day-to-day lives, are the true stars here. They help make the world feel alive. Part of this is down to the way in which you encounter them, again thanks to the dynamic nature of the Nemesis System. But partly, it's just because it feels like there's more personality given to a single orc than the rest of the NPC cast combined. The soundtrack is similarly mundane, missing the epic bombast of the Lord of the Rings or Hobbit movie trilogies in favour of a musical style that doesn't quite gel with the game you're playing. It's fairly forgettable, and when you do notice it while it's playing, it's fairly unimpressive. The one caveat is when orc captains enter the fray and the soundtrack starts chanting their name.
Nobody in Mordor understands what I'm saying, but they all get the point eventually.
Combat remains largely unchanged from 2014's Shadow of Mordor, which is probably for the best because it didn't really need to change much. It's mostly about mashing X to attack, whilst watching out for enemy attacks that need to be countered or dodged, which feels just as satisfying as it did in Shadow of War's predecessor. The moveset has been expanded, though Shadow of War does annoyingly nerf Talion, resetting his abilities back to 0 and forcing you to upgrade again to reacquire the skills you had in the previous game. This time you're able to augment Talion's abilities, such as my favourite move Shadow Strike, which can be upgraded to kill multiple targets, pull enemies towards you, or instantly dominate lesser or broken orcs. The tree is incredibly intimidating at first, but you'll quickly get a handle on it, in large parts thanks to the game handing out skill points like mini Snickers bars on Halloween night. There is, however, a poorly implemented gear system to contend with. Probably owing something to the randomised loot boxes, Shadow of War features gear of varying tiers, from standard up to legendary. It's a system that the game doesn't really need, having to sort between varying swords, daggers, bows and armor pieces that incrementally get more powerful as you level up, forcing you to stop playing to consider whether the level 23 rare sword you picked up is better than the level 22 legendary you're currently rolling with. You're also able to unlock gem sockets that can increase damage, health or wealth, and craft multiple gems together to create slightly more powerful versions of the same effect. It's an unneeded set of mechanics that seems to forget that the power of Shadow of Mordor's combat was in the actual act of fighting, and largely does nothing other than get in the way of an otherwise immensely satisfying fighting system. The inclusion of loot boxes does its best to destabilize the balance of gameplay, not by artificially increasing the grindy nature of the game. Shadow of War is a grind, but it all feeds back into the fantastically designed Nemesis system, which is something you'll want to consistently revisit anyway. Their inclusion, whether you're using them or not, actually makes other aspects of the game depressingly simple and unsatisfying. Basically anything that can be unlocked with Mirian is messed up by them in some way or another. The game doles out so much of its in-game currency expecting you to sink it into the game's heavily advertised marketplace. If you don't do that, you can basically overpower yourself. Fortress sieges take the biggest hit in this regard. They're already fairly weak in design. Capture a series of points to trigger a boss fight, or defend the points if you're on the defensive end of things. You can already make these sieges much less challenging by offering war chiefs to nullify enemy defenses, but there are upgrades you can purchase with Mirian to make those assaults a foregone conclusion. If you're not spending Mirian on loot boxes, which you absolutely shouldn't be, then you're going to easily afford these upgrades. Honestly, they allow you to pretty much walk through a fortress like you already own it, and even make assaulting the fortress with all its war chiefs and defenses intact much less of a challenge. The same goes for upgrading legendary weapons, unlocking gem slots, and basically anything else that requires the in-game currency. Because you've got nothing else to sink your massive stockpile of Mirian into, because you don't want to break the Nemesis system like I did, then you can make things a hell of a lot easier for yourself. It also has to be mentioned that the orcs that you do find in loot boxes, if you choose to go down that route, can also nullify much of the challenge of the game. Legendary orcs take the absolute piss in terms of being overpowered, seemingly having been balanced specifically for the endgame even in the early stages. A level 15 orc that came straight out of a box can carve his way through an orc warchief 20 levels higher than him with absolutely no help from the player. Shadow of War is also plagued with some serious quality of life issues. Having to pick up loot manually, which can be fixed with a high level skill, having to manually find the collectibles scattered throughout the map when you reach the top of a tower, and some bafflingly convoluted menus are all minor annoyances, yes, but they're also things you constantly have to deal with throughout your playtime and can really start to grind on you when you're 30 hours deep.
My prey! The ranger's wings bring him flight.
Without the Nemesis system, Shadow of War is an average open world game at best. Its gameplay, both in terms of its world traversal and combat, are excellent, but it's a game with a poor main narrative that really does next to nothing to pull players along, with unimpressive quest lines, collectibles, and non-orc characters that wear thin long before you're even halfway done with the game. There are some poor textures hidden in its otherwise impressive graphics, and its non-orc voice acting and soundtrack are equally unimpressive. The game's loot boxes also do their best to destabilize both the economy and some of the game's challenge. It's saying a lot then that the Nemesis system itself almost nullifies all of these complaints. Where the rest of the game does a poor job of hiding its lackluster content, the Nemesis system sees Shadow of War come to life, enriching an otherwise boring open world game with a living, breathing world where you go to war with a delightful and memorable cast of dynamically created characters, letting each of its players have vastly differing experiences. Just don't use the loot boxes, whether you purchase them with cash or in-game currency, because they will ruin the only exceptional thing that Shadow of War has going for it. Thank you very much for watching this video, guys. If you've enjoyed it, please consider leaving us a like or a comment or even subscribing to the YouTube channel. And as always, keep your eyes on wordsaboutgames.net for everything that we do, including all of our reviews, our gameplay videos, our interviews, and our weekly podcast. Have a great day, guys.